everybody, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Jess, and these are my vibrant visions. Settle in, let's make something cute together. Recently, I'd been really inspired by a few other creators who I saw put their own spin on this A to Z food creature series, and I felt like I needed to give it a try for myself, so I started with apple pie for A. First, I laid out some silver clay and put a wall around that to be the pie tin that will act as the base for the rest of the apple pie later. I stretched the walls a bit, made sure everything was connecting, and then ended up reinforcing all of the connecting walls and smoothing all of that out off camera before moving on to the texture. I knew right away that adding texture instead of color was the right way to go here. I normally do like adding color, but in this case, I felt like it would just muddy everything up and I wouldn't get that shiny effect that I was looking for in the end. So I just added some ridges and lines across the edges and the top of the pie tin until my little heart was content that it looked wrinkled enough as a pie tin would. I did skip to the end of this process. I figured even sped up, it was kind of a lot to sit through, and then I moved on to the pie crust. I made sure the pie tin was laid out flat and then took some premixed clay from earlier and one of my ball tools and smoothed everything out until I felt content that the two layers were connected underneath. Then I took my blade and cut around the edge of the pie. I also flipped it over so that I could clean everything up and just make sure that it was nice and circular. After that, I ended up adding some tubes of clay around the top to add a little bit more of a lip to the pie crust and smoothing all of that out. But I'll be honest, at this point, I still wasn't super happy with how things were looking, so I added some texture to the pie crust as well. I played around with a couple of different tools when I started the texture, but ultimately ended up sticking with that green ball tool from earlier, and once I got the texture on the outside of the pie crust, I was a lot happier with how everything was starting to look. At this point, it was starting to flatten out a little bit, so I pushed up the walls before starting on the apples. For the apples, I took some more premixed clay and just started giving them a rough shape. And you'll have to trust the process and just stick with me for a moment because I know they look really yellow for the inside of apples, but I did use a translucent white as the base along with a little bit of opaque white and some yellow chalk pastels. And the idea was that when they came out on the other side baked, they would resemble cooked apples instead of these little yellow blobs. Once I was happy with the shape, I started making the little dimple where you'd find the stem of the apple, and then I moved on to the color. I wanted the color on the apples to be really vibrant and have a lot of depth, so I started with the brightest color I could, being this bright green, which was actually a mix of the yellow and green chalk pastels that I have, and I put that in a couple of places until I was content with it. Then I moved on to this light orange shade and put that around the green spots just to sort of help everything blend out from there. And then I graduated to this darker orange color that I pretty much put over the entire apple at that point, in order to add a base layer where there wasn't one already and blend the rest of the colors together. And once I was satisfied with how that was looking, which did take quite a while, I moved on to the pink and red mix that I finished everything up with to brighten it up and tie all of the colors together. In order for the apples to not lose their shape when I cut them, I threw them in the fridge while I finished the project, and then I moved on to the gecko itself. My inspiration for the creatures in this series was a leopard gecko, so I started with the tail because in my opinion, their chonky little backside is their most identifiable feature, so I wanted to make sure I got the proportions right on that before I moved on to making his body. I just cut another piece of clay and made an oval. I smushed that around until it was to my liking and made sure that the top of the body was slightly upturned so that when everything was said and done, it looked like he was propped up standing in the pie. After that, I gave him some front legs, and I will be honest with you guys, he doesn't have any back legs or feet. They would be covered by pie filling after everything was finished, so I didn't feel like it was really necessary in this case. I added a little crease, and at this point I decided his tail was in the way, so I took it off to finish the other leg, and then I reattached everything for the final time once he had a crease in the other leg as well. Once I got his tail attached for the final time, I started to smooth everything out, basically just to make sure that those two pieces were secure and that his tail wasn't going to fall off at any point. But he started to look a little bit rough. So after I was finished with that, I took a strip of clay and just reinforced where I had smoothed it all out and smoothed it out all over again. Ultimately, I think this made a really big difference in that part of the project. It was looking really messy before, and I think it did a lot to clean it up and just smooth everything out. So I finished that up on the back side just to make sure I didn't miss any spots, and then smoothed everything out with my hands. And at this point, I felt like he was really starting to come together. So I started on his head. For his head, I just took a diamond oval shape and squished the nose and some little ridges for eyes. I really don't know how to explain it very well, but this is how he came out looking. And then I smoothed out where his head and neck connect. And after all that was said and done, I did prop him up a bit to see how everything was looking. And at this point, I did realize his legs were in the wrong spot, so I fixed that off camera. Once I was finished, I cleaned him up with some Q-tips and some ISO because at this point he was clearly very dirty. Then my phone died, so I did unfortunately lose the bits of footage where I would have been cutting the apples, finishing his face and coloring, and filling the pie with them. The footage picks back up just in time for me to put the apple pie filling in the pie and all over the gecko and the apples that I put in there. At this point, I was starting to run out of pie filling, so I ended up being really thankful that I mixed the wrong color originally. It was just too dark, but with a little bit of liquid clay and some orange chalk pastels, it ended up being the perfect color to finish off the apple pie filling. I finished filling the pie, and with the little bits of liquid clay I had left over, I just dripped a bit more on some of the apples as well as his face to finish everything up before moving on to the lattice crust. I don't know about you guys, but when I think of apple pie, the first thing that comes to mind is a lattice crust for the top. I think it's so cute and it's kind of a classic, so I just felt like it would be a disservice not to do it. So I just laid all of the clay pieces out in an alternating pattern until I had enough surface area to work with. And because there were so many moving parts and back and forth, this did take quite some time, I will be honest. Once I finally finished laying out the pieces for the crust, I started by adding some color, and I just put this in the majority of places and blended it all out to make sure that it really came across as a baked good once it was finished. I also went back and darkened up all of the places where it overlapped because if this were a real pie, it would be darker there. I laid the pie on top for a guideline and made a rough outline of where I wanted to cut out, and then removed that to actually cut out the top of the pie from the lattice I had made. And I did have a little bit of trouble here actually. When I tried to lift it up, you'll see here in a second, a couple of the places broke, but in the end, I think I figured it out. I laid the lattice crust on top of the pie, and after that, I just played with it, made sure it was secure. I took a couple pieces apart so I could maneuver them around his tail and his head so that it looked more like he was popping out of the pie, and also just went around and made sure all of the edges were secure. But I had to be really careful when doing this because if I tipped it over too much, all of the filling would start dripping out of the pie. I played with the crust pieces a little bit more, ripped a couple off, tucked them in, cut some off, made them shorter. Really just anything I could do to make it look like he was popping out of the pie as much as possible. And at this point, I really felt like everything was starting to come together. I was so happy with it. I did end up adding a little bit more shading around the lip of the pie crust, and I just thought he was so cute and adorable, but I did still feel like it was missing something. Luckily, I had a bit of scrap clay from his body and the apples I made earlier, so I decided to utilize that. I made 4 additional apples, and just like last time, I started with shaping them, but unlike last time, I went a little bit of a different way with the color. When I was little, I always remember my Grammy having two different kinds of apples in the kitchen when she was making apple pie or any sort of baked good with apple. She said the tartness came from the Granny Smith and the sweetness came from the Fuji. So I made a couple of green ones and a couple of red ones, and I thought it was a really cute and nostalgic way to wrap up the project. So I finished dry brushing the color onto the apples, and when I was done with that, you'll see me play around with the positioning a bit of the apples. I thought at first I wanted them to be in front of the apple pie, but ultimately I decided to keep all of them on top of the gecko. And when I was finished with everything, I did end up glazing all of this off camera after the baking process. And here's the finished product of my apple pie gecko and the first part of my A to Z food creature series. Okay, that's it for today, guys, but thanks so much for stopping by. See you next time.